We're now going to begin section 4.1. We're going to start with a definition for a function. The easiest way to define a function is to say that a function is a rule that relates two sets of numbers. To illustrate this definition, I'm going to give you an equation, y is equal to x plus 3. Let's look at that equation, and let's remember in previous math classes how we made a t-table or a table of values to go with a particular equation. I want to remind you of how to do that here. So if you remember, a t-table has a column for the x's and a column for the y's. You are given the freedom to select any x value that you want. So I'm going to go through and select a few x values. I'm going to pretend maybe that x is equal to 3. I'm going to do an x value of 1. I'm going to do an x value of 0. And maybe an x value of -4. Again, you can select any numbers that you want for the x values. Now, for the y values, you want to calculate based on your rule, and remember that this is your rule, you want to calculate what each of the y values will be. So let's begin with our first x value, which is x is equal to 3. So if x is equal to 3, I'm going to take a 3 and plug it in right here for the x. So in place of this x, I'm going to put a 3. And then I'm going to look at what happens. So what is y equal to if x is equal to 3? Well, we know that 3 plus 3 is equal to 6. And so I can come to the y and I can type a 6 in for the y value that goes with that x value. Now I want to do the same thing for the next x value. So if x is equal to 1, I'm going to put a 1 in place of the x, and I'm going to calculate. So y is equal to 1 plus 3, and 1 plus 3 is equal to 4. Our next x value that we chose was a 0. So I'm going to come up to my equation, and in place of the x, I'm going to put a 0. So if we have a 0 there, what do we get for the y? Y is equal to 0 plus 3. We know that that's equal to 3. And finally, our last x value is -4. So I'll come to my equation, and in place of the x, I'm going to put a -4. Now, if you're not good at adding and subtracting the numbers when you have negatives, you remember that you have your calculator. So type this in your calculator, -4 plus +3, and you should end up with a -1. Okay, so now that we have our table of values done, let's go back and think about our definition for just a second. Our first question is asking us, what is the rule? So the rule, what happens when you have an x value? What do you do with that x value? The rule is that you take your x value and you add 3 to it. All right, so the equation itself tells you what the rule is. Okay, so this tells us, I'm just going to put this right here, this tells us to add 3 to each of the x values. Okay, so now we know that the rule is the equation. It says it relates two sets of numbers. So let's ask ourselves, what is the first set? The first set of numbers is this set here. That's my first set. So it is all the x values. And that set of all the x values is called the domain. All right, what's the second set of numbers? So my second set of numbers is this set. So that set is all the y values. And the set of all the y values is called the range. So we now know what the rule is, we know what the first set is, we know that the second set is the range, we know that those two sets of numbers are related by that rule, x plus 3. Now, it is important to note that when we go to the point of looking at a function instead of an equation, we do have a slight change in the notation. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make that change for the notation. We'll have an x value, but instead of saying y, okay, we don't normally say a y, we say f of x instead. All right, so I'm going to write that right here. And I'm going to cross out that y. Okay, now nothing else that we do changes. All right, so when we are looking at a function, we would have an f of x instead of a y. Our original rule would potentially look like that kind of notation. So when I came down here for my function and I wanted to write that rule in function notation, then what I would have would be something like this. But that's it. Okay, so the only difference that we're going to worry about between an equation and a function is the notation of changing the y to an f of x, and I'm sure you've seen that before. Okay, so let's look at the first skill that we want to be able to do. The first skill is we want to be able to evaluate a given function. So we are going to come in, and for our first example, we'll have f of x is equal to 3x plus 4, and we want to find f of 5. Now, the notation is maybe a little bit different here. What you want to remember is that when they're asking you to find f of 5, okay, normally that's f of x, but now it's f of 5. So what we know is that the x is the same thing as the 5. Okay, so I'm just going to make myself a note of that. I know that the x is equal to 5. And now I'm going to work at finding the answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to, where there's an x, I am going to put a 5. So there's going to be a 5 coming in right here in place of that x. All right, so I'm just going to write it out. We've got 3. And we're going to put the 5 in for the x. I'm putting it in parentheses just so I remember that it's multiplication. And then I have plus 4. And we want to calculate that out. All right, so remember your order of operations tells you to do your multiplication first. So 3 times 5 is 15. And we're going to add the 4, and our final answer there will be 19. Okay, so again, the most important thing that you want to realize is that when you have this notation, that you want to remember that that means that the x is equal to 5. Okay, so let's try it again. Same problem, we're doing f of negative 2. So we want to remember in this case that the x is equal to negative 2. Okay? All right, so let's look at how this is going to look when I set it up. I'm going to take 3, and I'm going to multiply by negative 2, and I'm going to add 4. All right, is everybody okay with that? If the x is -2, I'm going to put the -2 in right there for the x. So I'll have 3 times -2 plus 4. Again, we're going to do our multiplication first. So 3 times -2 is -6. We still have the plus 4 tacked on. And -6 plus 4 is going to give me a final answer of -2. Okay. All right. Everybody okay with that? Good. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing for the other ones. We're just going to kind of practice a few more. So remember that you're going to take the number inside the parentheses and you're going to say that that is your x value. All right, so let's look at working out this next one. All right, so in place of the x, I'm going to be putting a 5. All right, so I'm going to write my fraction out first. And then I'm going to substitute in, I'm going to keep it in parentheses, I'm going to substitute in my 5. And then I'm going to have -9. Now, at any point, you can go to your calculator with this, and I might recommend that you do that now, that you just type in your calculator, 2 divided by 5 times 5 minus 9. Okay, if you want to actually do your algebra on this thing, you're going to say to yourself that these 5s will cancel out because you have 1 in the top and 1 in the bottom. And so that's going to leave you 2 minus 9. And 2 minus 9 is going to end up being -7. Okay. All right, so let's try our next one. So our next one, we have a -20. So again, that -20 is going to go in for that x. All right, so I'm going to do 2 over 5. I'm going to multiply by -20. And then I'm going to subtract 9. Okay, so 2 over 5 times -20. All right, so let's think about how we're going to do this. We probably want to remember that that -20 is over 1. It's a whole number. Okay, so I can multiply those two fractions together by multiplying the two top parts together and then the two bottom parts together. So 2 times -20 is -40. 5 times 1 is 5. And then we're still going to have this -9. All right, -40 divided by 5 is going to give me -8. And I still have a -9. And then at that point, if you haven't already gone to your calculator, I would definitely say go ahead and type that in. -8 minus -9 is going to give me -17. Okay, and then our last one, we have an x value of 3 going into our function here. All right, so we're going to have 2 over 5. And we're going to be multiplying by 3. And then subtracting off 9. All right, so again, we're going to assume that that 3 is over 1. We're going to multiply the two numerators together. So 2 times 3 is 6. And 5 times 1 on the bottom is going to be 5. I would probably go ahead on my calculator and do 6 divided by 5. So that's going to give you 1.2. And then you're going to subtract off the 9, which is going to give you 7.8. -7.8. Okay, so you've seen 5 examples where we have this function notation, f of something or h of something, whatever the letter is, and we're remembering that whatever is in the parentheses is going to go in for the x. Now, you also have another format that you can see with a problem like this. You can actually have them just tell you that the x value is a certain value and ask you to plug it in. All right, so I've done a couple like that just so you can see the different notation. It means exactly the same thing. All right, so our function is going to be 3x squared minus 5x. Our x value is -5, so we're going to go through this function, and everywhere there's an x, we're going to put a -5. So it actually goes in 2 spots in this function. All right, so I'm going to start with my 3, and in parentheses, I'm going to put my -5. That's plugging in for the first x. Now, note that that first x is squared, so I'm going to put the squared up there. And then I have a -5. And we come to another x, so we're going to plug in that -5 again. All right, order of operations tells us to handle exponents first. Okay, but again, if you want to type it in your calculator right now, you can go ahead and do that. But I'm going to work it out here just so that you can see it. So -5 squared, that's -5 times -5, which is going to give me a positive 25. And I'm just going to rewrite the rest of this. Okay, we'll do our multiplication next. So 3 times 25 is 75. A -5 times a -5 is a positive 25. And so adding this 2 together, we're going to get a positive 100 for our answer. Okay, we'll do the same thing on the next one. This time we're told that x is equal to 2. So you can go ahead and work it as I'm working it. We're going to plug the 2 in 2 places into the function for the x. All right, so I'm going to start off by writing my 3 down. Then we're plugging in the 2 for that first x and squaring it. Then we have a -5, and we have another x, which we're going to substitute in with that 2. And we'll do the same thing. We'll do our exponents first. So we're going to take that 2 squared and go ahead and make that 4. We'll do our multiplication next. So 3 times 4 is 12. 5 times 2 is 10. And we know that 12 minus 10 is going to equal 2. All right, for our last one, we have as our function x squared plus 3x plus 2. And our first x value is -2, so we're going to plug it in again in 2 spots. So we'll plug it in right off the bat at the beginning. So we've got a -2, and we'll keep it in parentheses. And we know that that's squared, so I'm going to go ahead and put my squared at the top. Get rid of that, sorry about that. All right, so now we're going to, let's see, so we've done -2 squared, so now we're going to do +3. And we've got another -2 to plug in right there. and then we have a plus 2. All right, so let's do our calculations. Again, exponents first. So negative 2 squared is going to be positive 4. Once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and do my multiplication right here. 3 times negative 2 is going to give me negative 6. And then I've got this plus 2 tacked on the end. So if I type this in my calculator, 4 plus negative 6 plus positive 2, that's going to give me 0 for my answer. All right, and the last part of this problem, we're going to be plugging in a negative 3/4. All right, so again, we're going to plug it in 2 places. So we start with it in the beginning in a set of parentheses that we're then going to square. Then we have 3 times that x value again, so we make another substitution. And then we have a plus 2 tacked on the end. All right, so when we square our first fraction, you're going to square the top and the bottom. So 3 squared is going to be 9, and it'll turn positive because you're squaring a negative. And 4 squared is going to be 16. All right, so our next one, we're going to treat this 3 as being over 1. And we're going to multiply the 2 top parts together and the 2 denominators together. So 3 times negative 3 is negative 9. And 4 times 1 is going to be 4 on the bottom. And then we have plus 2. So we have not talked a whole lot in class, or maybe not even at all, about finding common denominators. So what I would ask you to do in this case is just simply type this in your calculator and get an answer for it. You can give it to me in decimal form, or you can give it to me as a fraction. All right, so as a fraction, it's going to be 5 over 16. Or as a decimal, it's going to be 0.3125.